This show talks about books that feature mental health and mental illness topics. There are many books that include this topic, and my hope is that more and more people know about them because they help to decrease the stigma and help people not feel so alone in their struggle. I am your host, Robin Tamanaha, licensed marriage and family therapist. Joining me today on this episode is my guest, Sheena Yap Chan, who authored the book Asian Women Who Boss Up. Hi, Sheena. Thanks for being my guest today.
Hey, Robin. Thanks for having me.
Hey.
Super excited to be here today to talk about the book. So yeah.
Yeah. So first, before we get started, I like my guests to, introduce themselves even more if they want. So other than what I said, is there anything you'd like to say about yourself? Who else you are? What else you do? Anything else you'd like the listeners to know about you?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Sheena Yap Chan. I was born in the Philippines, moved to Canada when I was 7, and currently I'm a keynote speaker, coach, author, and podcaster on building self-confidence. I currently have a podcast called The Tao of Self-Confidence where I interview Asian women about their journey to self-confidence. And that was super important for me, especially growing up in Canada without any Asian female role models to look up to. I knew that we needed that for our current and future generations so that we can show them what's possible for themselves and also have a support system because dealing with my own confidence issues, I really couldn't find any support systems that really catered to Asian women. So a part of me felt like maybe I was the only one going through confidence issues, but I know we all go through it. And I know as in our Asian upbringing, we're always told never to talk about our problems, keep it to ourselves, which really isn't good because then we go through so many, mental health challenges and illness issues because we keep everything in. And especially with what's been going on in our community with Stop Asian Hate, women have been targeted 2.5 times more than men because of this. So now it's time for us to speak up and, speak our voice, fight back, and be the representation we need to be. So that's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks for that. And two, I'm so excited because you're like also a fellow Asian podcaster, and you're the first fellow podcaster I've had on as a guest. And I'm
Oh,
so
wow.
excited that woman and Asian. So super, super excited about that. And I read your book and I love it. I blew through it like really, really quickly. One of my favorite genres of books is actually memoirs. And so the way, that the book is composed with lived experiences and like stories was something that was like a favorite of mine. And also reading all the different stories, of the women was really inspiring and I think empowering. And just like you said, we don't always talk about things, and I think as women, there's certain maybe overt or covert, messages that are relayed to us about communication and feelings and mental health, and so the fact that, each chapter kind of touched on it in different ways I thought was really, really neat and so important, because like you said, like even me myself, like I don't remember having a lot of role models and what was said as far as being a woman or an Asian woman was not really something I so much resonated with or was kind of conflicted about.
Yeah, and I think it's so important now too to create more and more representation in different forms of media, right?
Mm-hmm.
Podcasting is a great form of media, but still a very small form of media. And so we need to tap onto bigger forms of media to get our faces out there, especially when it comes to books, right? I personally don't see that many Asian women on a cover of a book, and that's just as important as the stories in the book. Yes, there's a lot of books that have been written by Asian authors, which are great, but it's like, where are the faces? I really
Yeah.
want to see all our faces. The more the merrier. There's no competition, there's enough seats out there for us to put our faces on there because it really matters when you pick up a book and you see someone that looks like you and you're like, wow, if she can be a writer, so can I, right? And it's just as powerful as reading the stories in the book as well. And like you mentioned, different Asian backgrounds, different careers, different stories. And that was so important because we still go through this stereotype that all Asian people come from China, right? Or we're all just one race when there's so many of us, right? And we're only good at one thing when we can all be multifaceted. So that's why it's so important to create, true representation, right? Especially like for the longest time, Asians in TV have been casted as like the typical Asian or like the hooker or like the one with the accent. Nothing's wrong with that, but it's like we're more than that, right? We need to be more than that. We can't always be casted as that token role or the token stereotype. We can do way more than that.
Yeah. And within the media too, like those roles too, sometimes the writers aren't, POC or Asian. So then it's also from like the perspective too of someone who isn't within the community. So it's not like a true reflection of like the diversity like within the Asian community, or what an Asian is, like you said, those that you mentioned are like the nerd. I remember, here in America, like that was, if I think back to like the 80s and 90s, like that's what it was. And even sometimes when I read books, it was like the high achiever, like the smart kid or teacher's pet, like, and I never related to that, you know. So I think it's so important for there definitely to be more Asian authors. So what led to the creation of the book, out of curiosity?
To be honest, I met a lady over the summer who does writing, who writes books, and we just met each other through another person, all virtually. And we were just talking about who I am and what I do and what I stood for. And she was just like, "Well, why don't we create a book, that's for Asian women, right? We'll call it Asian Women Who Boss Up." And I was like, yeah, why not? I mean, we're all in quarantine. We got nothing else to do. We might as well create it, right? And when we created it, this was in the summer of 2020. And by the time we released it, we didn't know the whole Stop Asian Hate movement was happening. It just kind of coincided together, right, as we were launching it. And so when we were talking about it, people were, asking us to be interviewed and talking about like, why is it so important for Asian women to speak up, right? And how can we, stop these attacks? Of course, we have to speak up, but it's also a part of our culture where we always keep things quiet. It's up to us to really now to speak up. And I know it's not easy. I know it can be scary because we have families, we have friends. We also don't want to be the target, but if nothing happens, like it'll just get worse, right? Especially for Asian women because of this model stereotype that we go through. I mean, that the shooting in Atlanta that happened in March was devastating, right? And then the victims are being blamed because they were considered sex workers, which is really unfortunate because sex workers are not, they're still human beings, right? We cannot judge someone based on their job, right? If that's what they want to do, great. Sometimes we don't even know. They might have been forced into that. That's something that's very typical, right? Among Asian women who are, promised the American dream and get scammed into doing something like that. So we don't know what's behind it, right? But it doesn't mean we should, judge them based on their jobs, right? Judge them based on what they do, right? Because it's not fair, right? They're still human beings trying to provide a life for themselves and for their families.
Yeah. How's how was it also doing this during the pandemic? I think, it was interesting because like the pandemic, a lot of people felt so like isolated, and so here's a situation too, where like you said, we're like, there's some silence, and I think too, sometimes us thinking like, how are we going to also take up space, as like an Asian, and so here's like a thing where there, these, the stories, you help them share their story, and then also during a time where people were so isolated too, and kind of to themselves, like, what was that experience like?
Well, I mean, of course, we screened through a lot of women, right? And wanted to make sure we had, women who had phenomenal stories, women who were ready for it, of course. The pandemic was not an easy thing to be in, right? Like our mental health issues was really, challenged by that time, even me including, right? Before this book project, I honestly thought it was the end of the world, it kind of felt like the Twilight Zone. And I was like, what is going on? Is this it? This is the end of the world because of, what's going on. And so I had no passion to do anything, right? I just literally binge watch K-dramas all day because I was like, well, the world's over. Might as well just watch all these K-dramas and like binge, right? And, COVID wait happened, but that's another story. But yeah, I mean, some of them I've interviewed before on my podcast, so it wasn't as difficult, right? At least they knew who I was. They knew what I stood for. I mean, they know through my podcast. I mean, I've interviewed over 700 Asian women on
Cool.
this topic. So they know I'm very passionate about elevating the Asian community, even more so Asian women, because we're so underrepresented and we're still seen as like this quiet and submissive being when we're not. So it was a bit of a challenge too, right? Because it was hard for me to like, what if people say no? What if people don't get what I'm saying? What if they don't understand what this is all about? And we always have those fears, right? Going through rejection, not knowing what to say. And of course, I made mistakes along the way. As I was trying to talk about it, but that's all normal, right? And I think it's okay to talk about this because we need to talk about what really goes on. Like, yeah, I screwed up a couple times. I got rejected. I didn't know if this project was going to happen, but we also made a decision that even if it took a year, we're just going to make it happen. It didn't take a year, thank goodness, but we were just committed regardless if it took a year or more until we found, 16 women or actually there's 18 women who would want to share their story. And so, I've seen a lot of amazing feedback from the book, especially from you. I had another person who told me how they love the interview style because they just feel more connected to the person, or they felt like they were interviewing the person. I recently just had someone, share it on LinkedIn because she finally got her book, from Canada to the Philippines. And during COVID, like it takes up to 45 business days for anything to be shipped out from Canada or the US to another country because of COVID. Yeah. Right. So when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, I'm so happy. Right. She finally got it. Like, the fact that I went across the world, like halfway across the world and it made it, it just brings me a lot of joy to see that people will do anything to read this book because it's so needed. And, just everyone saying like, yeah, Asian women have been bossing up for so long, but nobody talks about us, right? And so now we're going to talk about it. We're going to create it. And I always say, if you want representation, it really has to start with yourself. Even if you have no clue what you're doing, even if you have to start from zero, because if no one else does it, who else will, right? Like it really has to start with you. And it's okay if it takes a while. I mean, it took me 5 years to get to where my podcast is today. It didn't happen overnight. And I think we're so bombarded with like this instant gratification, especially being a child of Asian parents, right? Especially when you're like in entrepreneurship or forging your own path. Of course, your parents are like, what are you doing? That's not the American dream. You're supposed to have a stable job, a home, white picket fences, be married with children. That's what success is. But really, success is how you define it, right? Do what makes you happy, right? Versus like, being told what to do. And as Asian women, we're always told what to do. We're always supposed to do one thing, live one way, and never rock the boat. And anything that's outside of that is just considered shameful. It's just shameful, which is like, is it really shameful, or you just say it's shameful? And we don't even know who started creating all these rules for us, right? I know it's from generations ago that just get passed on generation to generation, because that's all they thought was, how to build a successful life. They didn't take the time to find any other way. So this is why now, we're more aware of what we're doing. We're aware of the traumas that we've been through, but it's also up to us now to take action on it and start speaking up, start being seen, start creating visibility, start speaking our voices, even being okay, just being vulnerable and saying, you know what, I don't know everything. I'm not perfect. I'm okay being not perfect, because the more we can do that, the more we can relate to others and they feel better because they're not the only ones feeling that way. Having that relatability factor is so important because we want people to feel like they're more than enough, even if they don't feel like they're perfect. They're more than enough out there to just go and do what they love, forge your own path, be an entrepreneur, whatever it is that they want to do.
Yeah. I love the like your podcast and like your book as well. It's very like mission driven, I feel like, which is really cool, And two, like there's so many expectations, or this feeling of like I need to be, like you said, perfect, or a certain way, when really like the human experience, everyone, Asians included, is all emotions, tough times, seeing what you're going to do with opportunity or creating it for yourself. I like how you said, taking a step towards what you want, and I think it can be looked at in different ways. I know it's essentially like a risk, right? Sometimes
Oh
like
yeah.
doing something that kind of maybe going against the grain or something like a little different than maybe what's financially comfortable or just, all different types of security. Um, but it's actually like an investment, really. Like it's an investment in yourself, in your happiness, in your fulfillment, maybe your mental health, and also like the life that you really want for yourself. Because oftentimes we're like working for someone else's vision or somebody else's dream or what we feel like we should, a lot of shoulds, we should be doing, as opposed to like what really makes us feel good, what makes us feel empowered, And so I feel like through the book too, and in your podcast as well, it's very much like putting out that message, which I think is so important, that it's okay. It's okay to have all these feelings. It's okay to like want to do something different. It's okay to like invest in yourself and just try this thing. I don't know, because you really want to try it, right?
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And, as Asians, like, we're so afraid to make mistakes. We're so afraid to fail. And because of that, we resist so much, right? Even me included. It took me a while to realize, like, I was just never meant to be going the same path as everybody else, right? And it came from, like, since kindergarten. Like, the teacher failed me from kindergarten for coloring outside the lines. And it's just crazy. That, like, we just have all these childhood traumas that we go through that we're not aware of. And if we don't work on ourselves and do the personal development, we wouldn't know, and it would stick to us. And then we have all these feelings of like, why am I not enough? Why am I like this? Why do I always fail? Right? When it's really like you were just meant to do something different. You were just meant to go against the grain. You were meant to be outside the lines, outside the box. But we don't know that unless we work on ourselves, or even,
Yeah.
speak to like mental health professional, right? It like the biggest thing with Asian culture is asking for help, right? If we go
Yeah.
out there and ask for help, it's considered a handout, it's considered as a weakness, but that could be our greatest strength, to ask somebody for help to help us feel better, right? And I love, like, how some of the stories in the book, they talk about the mental illness they go through and how they live with it, right? Even on my podcast, how they said, I have a mental health therapist that I talk to, and that helps me. And before, none of us could say that, right? It would have been considered like very shameful. And because mental health is such a huge stigma in Asian culture, it's either like they avoid it or don't bring it up, or they do the total opposite and just put you in some institution because they just don't want to deal with it. I mean, I have some family members who think that mental health doesn't exist, and it's like fake, right? And it's just like, you want to say something at the same time you can't, because if you're trying to change someone's perspective and they already know what their perspective is, then it's useless, right? Why would I waste my own spit trying to convince them something? They have to figure it out on their own.
Yeah. Mental health, such a huge topic. I would say, and I think too, they get confused. Sometimes like mental health and mental illness, and both are okay to talk about. Because like essentially like everyone has mental health.
Oh
It's
yeah.
just whether or not they kind of get in touch with it, right? Or certain like level of mental health, right? And yeah, within the Asian community, I think fortunately, like it's been coming around, but it's like hard because someone may be confronted with like, okay, say like, especially the younger generations. Like I love like millennial Gen Z because they're so like all about mental health, like and talking about therapy. But then confronted with others, maybe like older generations or like, maybe more, others in their family where that's not so much like the norm. Right. So then kind of confronted with like, I want to, but can I? And essentially like it's completely, it's okay, because then what happens, it just kind of gets bottled up or things just kind of build. And then at some point it's like a pressure cooker where it's gonna come out
Well,
in some way or another, sometimes
yeah.
physically too, through like physical pain. I've seen that. Um, so reading that in the book as well was really, really, interesting too. And like how they navigated the stories, with that and just saying it, like, hey, like this is okay. Like I have feelings, I have emotions. I'm going through struggle. This is really, really hard. And I'm talking about it, and I think there's probably so many people out there who may be feeling that same way. Like I'm a therapist, and obviously like I love books because there's like a ton behind me. And I always say like, and this is why I think your book is like so powerful and wonderful in this sense is sometimes not everyone is ready for therapy, but they may be ready for a book. And sometimes that is the step towards that it's okay. Right. And so I hope too through people that read this, that it kind of sits with them a little bit, in
Yeah.
that sense and kind of makes that connection or resonates. Because I think there's so many different stories within it someone could resonate with one of them or parts of it. Like I feel like I connected with a lot of different ones in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. And especially as women, especially Asian women, when you have just the mental health challenges that you go through pre-pandemic, then you have the pandemic, then you
Mm-hmm.
have the Stop Asian Hate, that all adds up, right? And it gets, it challenges us a lot more. And it's like we need an outlet to just kind of like, you know, let it out, whether it's reading a book, talking to someone, listening to a podcast. And, it's okay to make those small steps, right? If you're not ready for therapy, then yeah, start with a book, start with a podcast, start with your friends.
Mm-hmm.
Because I believe it's those small, actionable daily steps that really give you the big results, right? It can start with a book, then maybe talking to
Mm-hmm.
your friend, and then maybe talking to someone who's a little bit more professional. Like there's no shame in that. And I think it's just learning to be open about mental health and mental illness and normalizing it and just dismantling all the stigmas around it, right? Because it's not only our community that faces this as a stigma. So many cultures face it as a
Mm-hmm.
stigma, right? To them, it's like it's the same. It's like similar thing. Like mental health is not talked about in their culture, but the more we can talk about it, the more other cultures can also be inspired to normalize mental health.
Yeah. I would say like the kind of like the professional level is like the biggest being seen. I'm being seen because I'm like sharing. And then there's also like in media or like representation in media or books is like the other ways of like I feel seen because I connect with this person or like I relate. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially when you have someone that kind of looks like you, that is so
Mm-hmm.
important. That makes it even better. And especially like the book industry is still, heavily represented by Caucasian people, right?
Mm-hmm.
They did a study 2 years ago that 75% of the publishing industry is still represented by Caucasian people. And that's not only by authors, that's also the publishing houses, the literary agents, the staff, and then everyone else has to share the other like 25%. So that leaves us with like next to nothing when we're trying to share it with all the other cultures. And so that's why it's so important for us to just create it. And it's not always an easy thing to do. Of course, there's going to be a lot of bumps ahead, but if we don't do it, no one else will. And like, I remember seeing this article, I think one of the big publishing houses did, and in order to celebrate diversity, they decided to get, like classics like Moby Dick and Frankenstein and decided to put like, a black character on the cover or an Asian character on the cover. And it's like, that's not diversity. That's just, you're trying to make yourself look good and it just failed, right? Why not get, people of color who are authors who do have an actual story versus trying to redesign a cover, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you find these amazing authors, who aren't Caucasian, who are, people of color, who are writing phenomenal stories, who could be a hit, and you just never know unless you go out there and try. And it's just so frustrating that we're still dealing with this in 2021, right? I
Yeah.
mean, books have been around for so long, right? And we still get what, less than 10% of representation. If maybe if we're lucky, if we get 5%, I don't really know what the numbers are. I was trying to find like the latest study, and all I could find was that in 2019, 75% of the publishing industry is still dominated by by Caucasian people. So, this is just, it's just crazy that we're still dealing with these things now.
Yeah. And, let me know if this is an okay question. Something that just kind of came to mind is, what was your experience like publishing? Publishing the book
Well, I didn't personally publish it.
or
I
kind of
work
the
with another
process, I guess.
lady, and she
Yeah.
has her own, publishing company. She's done it before, so
Yeah.
that's
That
why I said
helps.
it's yeah, help is important, right? Because you're
Yeah.
not going to do everything on your own, especially as women, Asian women. We like to do everything on our own. But like, if there's someone who can do a better job than you, then you might as well hand it out to them.
Mm,
And, I know sometimes giving money to people is not fun, but it's like, if you want something good, you want to pay the money for it. So it does come out as a great product, a great book to read with the stories and everything. So I
yeah.
personally didn't publish it. I collaborated with someone else who's done this before, and we worked together to make this book happen.
It's important to, and it's okay to have help.
Yeah, it's okay to ask for help. I
Yeah.
think that's the most important thing, right? Especially
Yeah.
as Asian women, like it's so hard for us to ask for help. It's so hard for us to take money from people. It's so hard. Like we have so many of these like stories we tell ourselves because of what our older generation has told us, and also like the traumas we go through, feeling like if we're gonna ask for money for someone, like we're doing something really wrong. But it's like if you're an
Mm,
entrepreneur and you have a product or service that's gonna help somebody, then don't be afraid to ask. If they say no, at least you know, right?
yeah.
The worst that could happen is they say no, they say they ghost you, or they just tell you to fuck off, right? So, and if you're okay with that, then just keep going because instead of focusing on the rejection, you'd be surprised who says yes, right? So you just got to keep on going, and it's okay. Like the more rejection you get, the more it builds like strength and courage for you to keep moving forward. Most successful people had way more no's than yeses, right? And they say like 90%, 99% of the time you're going to get no's, but that 1% or 10% or whatever it is will make a huge difference, right?
Yeah.
A great example is the light bulb, right? Thomas Edison found 10,000 ways for a light bulb not to work, but the one time he made it work, like, look, light bulbs are everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so it's important to share these things and realize, like, it's all part of the journey, and it's bumpy. It's bumpy because there's no such thing as like a linear like journey. It's like a roller coaster,
Yeah.
and talking about these is it's so important and refreshing for other people to listen, because I'm pretty sure there's someone out there who's feeling like how do they have it all, how do they do it all? It's
Mm,
like, well, I don't do it
you
all,
don't.
right? I
No.
ask for help, I go through stuff, I'm not always 100% confident, but I work on myself every day as well so that I can be better, and so I can pick myself up a lot quicker than like maybe 10 years ago.
Yeah. I think too, like with media or like social media, we always see like the end, right? And like, oh, there they are now. And so I think there's like this assumption, like, how did they get there? We
Oh
didn't see the
yeah.
before, right? And like all the struggle along the way. I think the most recent one, which I'm going to start watching this show next week, the creator of Squid Game
Mm-hmm.
and how he
Oh
got
yeah.
denied for 10 years to the point where he had to sell his laptop to pay the bills. And then the one that said yes ends up being on Netflix, right? And this is going to be like the number one
Most
show.
watched show.
Yeah. And so that's also like an example of, what kind of that timeline. And it's unfortunate they got said, he got told no for like 10 years, but there was that one yes. And now like, look what's happened and what that's done, especially for the Korean community too, which is like wonderful,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah,
Hmm.
and even like, someone as big as like BTS, like
Yeah.
their journey wasn't a walk in the park either. They got bullied, they got made fun of. People thought they were copying other people's music.
Mm.
I mean, it was hard for them, right? Like it was really hard. Like people don't realize what they had to go through to be like the most popular band in the world. Like they went through their own hardships, right? And also racism, and also other stars using them to gain popularity, right? Like
Mm.
they just wanted to collaborate with them because they know they could get the clout versus like genuinely be making like music, right? To like entertain people.
Wow. Is there anything I didn't bring up that you wanted to share?
I think for me, it's just I really love sharing some of the stories that's in the book, because
Yeah.
I'm sure pretty sure people are always curious, like, what are
Yeah.
some of these stories,
Yeah.
right? And it's just really like a snippet. Like one of the stories in the book, one lady, talks about how she was diagnosed with breast cancer and sued by the FTC at the same time. And can you imagine not one but two like really bad, unfortunate like incidents back to back, like could like happening to you? I mean, I don't know what I would do. I'd probably cry and hide from the world for the rest of my life, but like I'm glad she was able to overcome that to be, a successful entrepreneur again. We had another girl who talks about living with multiple personal disorder or multiple personality disorder, and that's not easy to talk about too, especially as an Asian person, especially as an Asian woman, being able to open up to that, right? Because like I mentioned, like mental health, mental illness is it's not a topic that our community talks about. It's something that we still like to hide from our family, right? So there's no shame, or we don't bring down our family name, which is very common in a lot of Asian cultures. There was another lady who talks about moving to America from Vietnam, and this was back then when all you could do was go on a boat, right, to travel, and got kidnapped by Asian pirates. I didn't know there was such a thing as Asian pirates, and I was like, this is just insane, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, those are just some of the stories that are in there. Of course, there's way more. There's phenomenal stories, but I mean, people are always curious, like, well, what makes it so great? What's in the stories? What kind of stories can I read from this? And it's like, well, here's some of them. And so,
Yeah.
that's why it's so important to pick up this book, because it's not just, it's about elevating our community, elevating people of color, elevating more people of color who are writing books, building diversity, and creating true diversity versus like the smoke and mirrors we see on media. So, and it's also a book with a cause, because part of the proceeds I will be donating it to nonprofit organizations that are fighting anti-Asian racism, and that's very important because, like I mentioned, Asian women are 2.5 times targeted more than men, and it's unfortunate, right, that this is happening to us. Like, every time I see an elderly being attacked, every time I hear a mother, being attacked while she's like walking with her kids, like that's not right, and it's just unfortunate that in 2021 we're going through this again, right? Because most people don't think that Asians ever like experience racism ever since they stepped foot in Canada and America, but we did. Like, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Japanese internment camps. Even back then, I just found out like Filipino women were not allowed to come to America unless they were married. So there was so many things happening. It's just that nobody talks about it in history books, right? So now it's important for us to, help as much as we can in any way we can, so that we can just create a safer environment for our culture, and not just for our culture, like, anything we do within our culture, it can still inspire other cultures to go out there and do the same thing, right? So, I mean, I know sometimes people like, people don't think I get hate, but I do. Right? I've gotten comments like, you're just making things more racist. And it's like, well, no, I'm not. Like, if we didn't have all these problems to begin with, we wouldn't have to do this kind of work, right? If everyone just like treated each other as equals to begin with, we wouldn't be here today talking about it. So, of course, you're not gonna please everyone, right? And I know as an Asian person, that's like our thing. We need to please every single person, but you know what? At this point, you know what you're doing. You're trying to do your best to make this world a better place, not for yourself, but just for current and future generations. And that's all you can do. And if we make mistakes, we just own up to it and just move on, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, so important. And I love that you're also donating. I was so happy to, like, when I got the book, I was like, oh, yay. So it's also going to go to another good cause and another good mission. Where can people purchase your book?
Yeah, for sure. So they can, if they would love a signed copy, they can go to my website, sheenayapchan.com/book, to order a copy of a book right now. Now would be a great time to do it because Christmas is literally around the corner. And we remember last year was just a hot mess trying to get gifts on time, and everything was just like, we can't get delivered now because it's just a hot mess. So if you were to order it now if you can, while the delivery times are still very, very fast.
Great. And what I'll do is I'll put that in the show notes, and then also on the website to booksbetweensessions.com with your social media handles as well. So,
Awesome.
yay. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. It was a pleasure to have you on. I'm so glad we connected too. So
Same here. I'm so glad I got to be on the show and talk about the book, and just really excited to just keep on, elevating our community and doing more work
yeah,
and just connecting with like-minded people like yourself.
definitely. Yay, yay, definitely. All right. Well, have a good rest of the week and thanks for being on. Okay. Thanks for listening. Hopefully, this was informative or helpful. If you think this episode may be helpful to others that you know, please be sure to share this episode with them. Resources mentioned on this episode can be found at the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. The social media handles and website for today's guest is listed in the show notes and on booksbetweensessions.com. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave us a rating. If you would like to stay up to date, please subscribe to this podcast and follow the podcast Instagram, Books Between Sessions. I post multiple videos and lives every month, so be sure to follow our Instagram so you can see extra content. And if you have any book suggestions or books you would like discussed on this podcast, please send us a message on the contact page of the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. If you're an author who has written a book that includes mental health or mental illness topics and would like to be a guest on the podcast, complete the form on the Be on the Podcast page of our website. Also, this podcast is not psychotherapy or counseling. If you need to speak with a professional, you should find one local to you and contact them directly. If this is an emergency, please call your local emergency number or go to your nearest emergency department.